Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Many thanks to all of you. I'd like to greet and thank Professor Fallico, the very soul of this event, the engine for the great confidence and trust he renewed this year by extending to me the invitation to come here and talk about such important themes such as energy is. I'd like to thank also another company, which is not only a commercial aspect. I must also thank the company which is mentioned in the slide. And apart from a specific interest, this is obviously a company of mechanical components. And I believe that this is a company which has been renewing itself for many years. It has been providing some support to the energy planning and territorial energy planning studies that are by now well consolidated. Now, obviously, the question you asked me is incredibly interesting. It has no answer, though. Machines are the ecosystems, the systems that change the energy into and bring it to the territory. They are the natural targets, especially with respect to the so-called benchmarks of naturalness. The topic I'd like to deal with is very broad, so I will confine myself to making considerations, reflections that could seem to have a philosophical dimension, or rather intellectual dimension, which is deep, and that should help us think. Now, since I considered myself being the objective of any such issues, I also want to think and wonder how to, in a century like this, in the first half of a century like this, how to consider the energy transition and have one which goes from your own fossil fuel-based economy to another economy which is based on renewable sources. Let me say that the problem of transitions should not scare us. And maybe the changes, the paradigmatic changes were greatly considered. Maybe this is the great lack of our culture. We've gone from the wood economy to the coal economy. The Industrial Revolution would have never taken place without this new energy source, which obviously could express much more than what the simple wood economy could express. So we've gone and switched economy even before having the wood being depleted. Now, maybe this is a concept which is not totally correct, completely correct, especially as far as the paradigms in this field. From oil we went to gas, then we even went through gas, and now the problem we are considering is how to carry out this energy transition towards renewables. Please allow me to say that in the first two sessions that were seen, and which did represent some 20 contributions, let me say and allow me to say that in these considerations there seems to be a ghost, sort of a ghost which is due to the increase of the green gas effect. And Professor Bazzoli was reminding us of this danger today in a very elegant manner, because Bazzoli is not an expert, a specific expert of this topic. The carbon problem, once in the atmosphere and once it starts building up, is no longer a non-debatable topic. So the fundamental problem is a problem which is very serious indeed. It has to be dealt with sufficient cultural pragmatism. The fossil economy is worth 10 billion euros a day. So it obviously expresses an economic power, financial power, with respect to which it is not possible to make comparisons while thinking of sources that have the characteristics of being refined, well distributed, available to everyone, and having a single need, which is the technological acceleration. So we are to wonder who is going to be leading and taking a step forward. So it's sort of a muscled comparison and confrontation, which is unprecedented. I believe that in the Euro-Asian continent, in this great large island, that there are some technological opportunities, raw material opportunities that are unique, opportunities that are scattered across the territory, that come along with some covered network area of some 14,000 kilometers. This is a territory where, from the energy point of view, it is possible for us to find both question and demand, or offer and demand of fossil fuels. So today maybe it's the time and the turn of fossil fuels, and then maybe tomorrow it's going to be one and the same and no longer useful. So we have to be highly pragmatic whenever accomplishing reasonings like this one. Otherwise, we are running the risk of just being merely academic. In one day, some 80 million barrels seem to be lost, and 1 million barrels whenever they are needed, they may be, and gas and coal may entail some possibilities, even reaching the moon and the sun. The physical space of an economy like this cannot be replaced by just simple reasonings or technologies, which are often one against the other. So this is the reason why I was considering this question, how to ensure the economic transition and the energy transition. Who should be the main actor in this sense? And then how to implement such a virtuous pathway through which mankind will see what is the economy which is no longer based on fossil fuels, but rather on renewables. The coal problem doesn't leave us with any hopes. On the top left-hand side, we have a concentration of carbon in the atmosphere expressed in particles per million. Take a look at the last 250 years, which shows a slight increase in concentration, which has not been matched by geological phenomena that have occurred. And there are some 400 institutes, international and intergovernmental institutes, that are involved with great skills and competences, and the 54 parts per million is representing a non-return point. One important thing in this area, whenever you touch upon variables that are environmental, then you say that don't have any technologies, return technologies, which is what could happen. But this is also undermining a positivistic orientation which comes from far away. The infinite non-replaceability and the inexhaustible technology. In order to fulfill this need and requirement, we now must be aware that there is no such a reference point. In the very moment when another thing is observed and other incontrovertible data are being observed, or for example the shrinking of the ice cap, and whenever we observe any such great things, we don't know how to get back. We don't know how to cool the oceans. We don't know how to refreeze a part of the glaciers that have been melting down. The responsibility of this increase is not only energy related, obviously. This is what probably may give us the declaration of intellectual honesty. Energy affects some 50, 65, 70% of the general trends, which are then also turning into something which modifies the climate. And quite obviously, we have to know that the remaining part is connected to the increase of population, cultural styles, and at the same time, in the bottom right-hand side, we see a correlation which is much too close, especially when it talks about the increased energy consumption, which is of about 80% in a moment of concentration in the atmosphere. So let me make a consideration which could appear to be in this environment politically incorrect. And this is the following one. Here I represented the reserves of the sources of the fossil resources, and within the reserves there is a subsystem known as P1. P1 entails as the certainty that the resource exists, and the source exists. The P1 reserves are considered as assets inside the budgets of the oil companies and of the energy companies. The P1 reserves refer to that quantity. We won't even read the figures. I am just interested in passing to you the message. And if we consider P1 reserves, we have this kind of situation. Now, obviously, 4 bottles of wine, to recap the concept, is something which is typical of our culture. But I'll show you what the problem is. If we move from the left-hand side, we have inside the P1 reserves a quantity of substances which is matched by a given quantity of carbon. This is something that can't be denied. In the very moment when, if we consider the 400 parts per million, as we can see in the second bottle, part of the fuels may be burnt, and you see the quantities there. That means that the remaining part, the residual part, cannot be utilized, will not be utilized. Those will be energy assets that could be no longer payable, with a financial value which is skimming $80,000 billion and 62 million euros. In the very moment when we were to empty this bottle with another quantity of fuels, and if we were to set the limits at 5,500 parts per million, then the temperature of the country would be increasing by 3 degrees. But if the degrees were to be 2.83 degrees, then the situation would still be difficult, because this is a problem which is only one way. It's coming with a one-way problem. In the very moment when we were to eliminate all this, then the situation would no longer be acceptable. So we should wonder whether we should really be using the fossil fuels characterized as reserves, P1 reserves, within our own planet. Quite obviously, this is not a warning for oil companies. It doesn't intend to be so. The economy is so large that it's unthinkable that you may replace it with some tiny rays of or beams of sunlight. And there are going to be a number of technologies which will be capable enough to carry out resource. And this is inclusive of an energy scenario where the renewables will account for 51% of the question and of the issue. So as just to make you grasp the idea of switching sides, there should be an entire story of actions that are going to be implemented, which will then in turn lead to whatever. Then there is an economic consideration, and as Professor Bazzoli was saying, I must say that I was really struck. The reckoning of the 445 parts per million objective would cost some 2.5 percentage terms over the year, starting from today to the year 2035. This is not impossible. We are talking of some 30 trillion of dollars, which represent some 5% of the GDP. $60 million accounts for a measurement or a counterpart, especially if we do consider the costs entailed by wars or the costs of the large energies which are then modified. And quite rapidly, I'd like to say that there is some core service of technologies. The first one is to limit of this kind of presence. So there is no better source than the one that doesn't show up in order to be eaten up. And the kilowatt hour per hour was not used for these purposes. So this is definitely a contribution. Then there are other important contributions, technological contributions, which should and must allow the economy to still go on working, especially when it rests upon fossil fuels. And the rest of the opportunity is the one of prolonging fossil fuels. We talk about making it larger by just mentioning the dimensions at home. And we've been doing this, and obviously another important source, another important contribution has got to do with the use of renewable sources, not the ones that we are used to working with, but rather we have to have a technological step change, which is rather important. On the concentration field, that could stand as a difference, because in the upstream area we see the solar energy, which has been concentrated and represents energy sources. On the lowest part, we have some conventional attitude. Who has to guide us through the energy changes? I'd like to benefit from this, and inevitably this is what will use and make comments on the 10 million euros. So definitely, this is definitely a scenario which is on the mind of everyone, especially for whereby the producers become main actors, and they may reach some 30, 20 or 40% of the resources. So there is a productive decentralization, which is a different model. So from a model like this one, you can see only very few points of distribution, points that are incredibly vulnerable, and there are some millions of products, production products, and this is a network which would be sort of succursing in all directions. This will be some 20% of my question. We can't live just out of the energy savings. So can you tell me who's going to carry out the passage? And so we know that we now have some technologies to use fossil fuels. It's important to use the property of the source, which can be removed at any time, and we know this because of people movements. And in energy, what's important is technology. This is why it is fossil fuels itself, such as the oil companies, the energy fossil companies, that are to become managing partners. They should be developing technologies that are renewable. And this is what could stand for a global production of energy, which comes with the characteristic names, but could ensure a longest use of fossil fuels, such as the drop in CO2 and its sequestration. It could allow for profits and remuneration of interest of the banks that have to bear the efforts. And there is no technological development which is even more so than the one that takes place within the energy sectors, renewable energy sectors. And this is why I was talking of a driver of the energy paradigm in the future that is going to be precisely seen in the future. Thank you.